Howdy folks, back again. So today what I want to do is I want to talk to you about Ford heads. Now there's been a lot of confusion over the years. And with good reason. I mean, Ford had a bunch of different engine families. I'm certainly not going to talk about all of them, but we're going to talk about the popular ones today. And I want to talk about some of the differences. So you've heard the term 351. You've also heard 351 Windsor, 351 Cleveland, 351 Modified, and then of course there's a couple other engine families that didn't have 351s, so we need to talk about those. So first of all, what we have is the most common 351 you will probably see nowadays is what they call the 351 Windsor. Now the Windsor got its name because it was manufactured at the Windsor, Michigan plant, and the 351 Windsor was basically a small block engine. It was a 4-inch bore with a 3.5-inch stroke, which is pretty typical of the 351 cubic inch motors. But it was very similar. The Windsor shared a cylinder head with the 302. The only difference is the Windsor 351 had a larger head bolt, so the 351 heads had a larger head bolt. It was a 1/2-inch head bolt hole in the head. The thing is, you can modify 302 heads and just drill the bolt holes out to 1/2 inch and bolt them right onto 351. So the heads are similar. This is a 302 engine, which is a small block. But if you look at the cylinder heads, this is the typical configuration of the 302 351 cylinder head. And we've got some heads sitting here, so I wanted to do a comparison on these because you can definitely see that there is a difference. So this is your typical Windsor cylinder head, or 351 Windsor head. That is the design of it. Now there were some variations. Some of them had studs from the factory and so forth. Other ones had bolt-down rockers depending on the year. The later ones had emission control passages drilled into them. So I don't want to get into really the best and worst on those because I've got a lot of other videos on it, and this video really isn't about getting into which specific 351 head, Windsor head, or you know, Cleveland head or whatever is the best. I just want to show you the differences between the engine families. So that is a typical 302, 351, 289 head. The valves are all in a straight line. There's no angling or canting of the valves. And if you look at the valves here, we got the intake valves out of this one, but the valves are in a straight line all the way down. And it has an intake manifold with a water passage on the intake side of the head. Now we move over to this head here, and just so there's no confusion, Ford had an FE family of heads. This is an FE head, and this head is basically a big block head. It really isn't dimensionally any bigger. In fact, it's probably a little lighter than the 351 head, because this engine had a huge intake manifold on it that spanned all the way across. In fact, the rocker shaft assembly bolts here, and the push rods actually go through the intake manifold here. So that is an FE head. So this would have been a 352, 360, 390, 428, and they also had the 428 Cobra jets that were this design. You can see there's a big difference between those two. They are not interchangeable. It's not the same head. One thing that's typical of Ford heads, though, is that was unique is they all pretty much had 10 head bolts in them. They did 5 head bolts along here and 5 head bolts along here, just on this end of the head and this end. And the same thing with this one, 5 head bolts, 5 head bolts. So that's very typical that Ford heads had. Big and small block, they basically had 10 head bolts, although the head bolt sizes did vary. So then we move on to this head here, and this is the 351 Cleveland slash modified family. Now what you'll notice on the FE heads is the water passages again are on the intake plane, and the manifold bolts up and the water goes through the intake. Same thing with the Windsor or 302-289 head. When we get to the 351 Cleveland, it's a little different animal. Now the 351 Cleveland was similar in size to the 351 Windsor as far as bore and stroke goes, but it's a different block. It's still considered a small block, but it had this head on it. Now one thing you'll notice that jumps out at you right away with this head is that this head has canted valves. The valves are canted, which means the valves are at a different angle. Now that is a big advantage for performance, because instead of having the valves on a single plane here, we have this valve angled over this way, and this valve here is angled over this way. So they're angled toward the center of the bore. So if you look at the valve guides and seats here, they angle the guides and the valves toward the center of the bore, which gives me less of a sharp turn radius for the airflow into the head, and it actually forces the air fuel toward the center of the bore. And it also allows the exhaust to be pushed out from the center of the bore, which is an advantage. Canted valve heads, also if the valve is canted or angled, I can put a larger valve in here without shrouding it. So they had the capability to use a larger valve in a more compact chamber with better flow, which was a big advantage. So let's talk about the 351 Cleveland, because this is actually not a Cleveland head, although it's very, very similar and it's kind of interchangeable. I mean, you could change them out. This head is off of a 351, what they call a modified engine. Ford wanted a bigger cubic inch engine that they could put in their luxury cars, and they also used it in their pickup trucks. So they wanted a 400 engine. Well, they didn't want to design a whole new engine. So what they did is they took the 351 Cleveland and they used that as a basis, but they modified it. Now there are some changes. The 351 modified, it takes that same design head that we saw on the Cleveland, but they changed some things on the block. One of the things they did is they put a big, beefier crankshaft in it. So the main journal diameter of the 351 Cleveland is 2-inch 750 thousandths, something like that. What they did with the modified is they took and they enlarged the main journal and made it 3 inches. So it's a 3-inch diameter main journal, so it's a bigger, beefier crank. The problem with the 351 modified and the 400, which was similar, the 351 modified was just a 400 that was de-stroked. So the 400 was based on the 351 Cleveland size or engine family, but they modified the engine. They changed the crankshaft size. They also changed the bell housing. So the bell housing in the back of the engine shares its bolt pattern with the 460, 429. So you're going to have a big block 460, 429 transmission for this engine. So, and that's different from the 351 Cleveland. Also, they changed the motor mounts. The 351 modified, which was basically a smog motor. The thing that killed the 351 modified was it had different motor mounts, it had a different bell housing setup, so you had to have a big block bell housing for it. The motor mounts didn't match any other Ford engine. They were unique to the 351M or the 400, which was basically an engine that was just completely choked out with emission control devices in the 70s, in the mid to late 70s. And so, and also the other thing is the 351 modified, the way it is differentiates from the 351 Cleveland is it has a taller deck height. So the crankshaft height or the block height from the center of the crankshaft to the deck of the block was taller, so that made it wider. Very difficult to get that to fit into a Mustang. Nobody really wanted to swap the 351 modified into a Mustang because it had motor mounts that had to be fabricated. It had different deck height, so it was a very wide block, and it was very difficult to get that fit into a Mustang without notching the shock towers and just doing all kinds of changes to it. And also, one of the things that was a problem is getting a set of headers on that thing, because it's so wide in the Mustang, was very difficult to do. You'd have to actually have custom made headers for it. So it was not a desirable engine to swap into the pony cars, the Mustangs or whatever. That's why you probably won't see them. The 351 Windsor and the 351 Cleveland, which share a similar deck height and are a more compact engine, even though the 351 Cleveland had the canted valve, the wider head on it, the block was not as wide, and so it was more desirable for swapping into a Mustang. Plus, it wasn't choked out with emission controls, and so you could get pretty good factory heads and compression ratios and so forth that ran pretty good. The 351M modified was basically choked out with emissions. It was very low compression, and it didn't have really a lot of support from the aftermarket. And in other words, they didn't make a lot of parts for it to modify it. Now, that's not to say you can't make the thing run. The point of this entire video is we're actually going to build a 351 modified. That's my next project here. In fact, it's right there. This is a 351 modified. So let's take a look at this thing. So, like I said, it does have a taller deck height, but it shares the bore and stroke with the 351 Windsor and the 351 Cleveland. It's basically a 4-inch bore with a 3.5-inch stroke. It has a really long connecting rod in it, which is good for a torque motor or a truck motor or a rat rod or whatever. But it's very similar. The front cover is the same as the 351 Cleveland. The water port area, you can see that it has water ports that go into the head here that are the same as the Cleveland head. And we will actually probably put a set of Cleveland heads on this, because one of the problems that we have is that the 351M heads had a really large chamber, and so they're very low compression. Plus, they put this dished piston in here. We're going to try to find a flat top piston or a better piston for this and get some closed chamber Cleveland heads on this thing and make it really run. The other thing is the exhaust can be a challenge if you're going into a small car. Now, these are the big 351 modified exhaust manifolds, and they have they're just this big bulky pore flowing manifold. I seriously doubt if we use that. And if you look at the heads, they got a giant combustion chamber with basically no quench area here, which is not really very good. It's basically a low compression smog head that was kind of a turd. So you really don't want to use that. And if you look at the back of this, you may recognize the bolt pattern. I don't know how well you can see it, but that is a 429 460 big block bell housing pattern. So it takes the same transmission as a 460, so you could get a good heavy duty C6 or whatever with a 460 bell housing and bolt to the back of this, and you got a pretty bulletproof transmission. The motor mounts here are definitely different. This is a 3-bolt setup. There's a bolt here, a bolt here, and a bolt here, which is a unique bolt pattern that no other Ford engine really had. So, and Ford did that on purpose because they didn't really want this to be confused with the 351 Cleveland. The 351 Cleveland just has 2 bolt bosses that go straight up, much like the 302. We got a 302 here, and you can see the motor mount bolts. They go there's one here and one here, and the motor mount bolts straight up with 2 bolts. That's very similar to a 351 Cleveland motor mount setup here. So you can see the contrast. It's very different. However, you can get motor mounts for these. Yes, and you may have to do a little bit of fabrication if you're putting this into an earlier Ford, but it can be done. I mean, you know, if you got a welder and a chop saw and some fabricating skills, you can do it. So one of the reasons that I want to build this engine is basically because these engines are readily available. The 351 Cleveland, if you try to go out and buy a 351 Cleveland, you're probably going to have to mortgage your house to get a good 351 Cleveland engine. Although they do run very good, and they're more compact and they do fit better in a Mustang or a pony car. But if you're building a rat rod or something, these 351 modified engines, because they're not real sought after, they're basically a dime a dozen. I mean, you can pick these motors up. I picked this thing up for like $50. So they're just a 70s smog motor that nobody really wants, and they weren't really considered a performance engine, but it is a 4-inch bore, 3.5-inch stroke V8. If you put the right heads on it and you get a decent aftermarket intake and you get a good set of headers on it, and you get the compression ratio up and get air into it, this thing will run just as good as a 351 Cleveland. The problem is the parts, a lot of the parts are not interchangeable. So that's one of the things that you got to think about with these heads. Now there's one more head here I want to take a look at, and that is this one on the end here. So if you look at the contrast, I'll try to back up a little bit here. So if you look at the contrast, you can see on the left there, next to my coffee cup, we have the 302 351 Windsor, and then we have the FE family, which is this guy here, and that's the 352 390. And then we go to the 351 or 351M or the 400 head. They're all very similar. Canted valve head, much like this one. This is 429 460. Now you can see it's a bigger engine. This is considered a small block. This is what's weird about this. Okay, so the Windsor is considered a small block. The FE motor is considered a big block. The 351 is considered a small block, which shares basically the same bore and stroke as this motor, but it has a different head with canted valves, which much more potential. And then we go to the canted valve big block head. You can see how much bigger that is. This is 429 460, and a lot of these had really big intake ports, big valve capability, and it is also a canted valve head. You can see the valves are angled, so they angled the valves toward the bore center, kind of like a big block Chevy. So the 351 Cleveland and the 429 460 was a canted valve head, and the head design is actually more desirable than the valves that are inline or parallel. So this is basically now this certainly isn't all the engines that Ford has made, but this is basically the Ford engine families that you're going to see out there. None of them are really interchangeable with each other. Now you can, the thing is, if you have a 351 Windsor like this, you can bolt this head onto that block. And what you got to do, though, and there's guys out there actually doing this, is because if you look at the water, the intake manifold is here on the Windsor. The water goes through the manifold here. Well, if you look on the Cleveland or the modified head, there is no water jacket here. So if you and not only that, the 351 Windsor manifold is not going to fit on this. It's a different deal altogether. The 351 Cleveland manifold is similar in width to the Windsor manifold. With the modified engine, which this head will bolt onto it, the manifold, we like to call this our redheaded stepchild. Because this manifold, because that motor has a taller deck height, this manifold is just absolutely unique to the 351 modified engine. It's got a different width, and quite honestly, I don't even think they made a 4-barrel version of that. I think they were all 2-barrel. Now this manifold's stripped down fairly far now, but when I first started taking this apart, man, there's so much emission control crap and lines on this thing, it's unbelievable. It's basically a piece of crap is what it is. So you really don't want to use that manifold for anything other than, you know, just a heavy-duty boat anchor. That's kind of a rundown of these heads. Obviously, the 460 head, if you look at it, is not going to be interchangeable with any of these blocks. So the 429 460 was another big block. So we got small block, big block, small block, big block. And that's basically the Ford families. This is the 429 460, 351 Cleveland, 351 modified 400, 352, 360, 390, 289, 302, 351 Windsor. And that's really what you're going to be seeing and dealing with out there. Now, as far as which heads are the best, basically when it comes to these factory heads, the only really decent heads, if you want to build a 351 Windsor or 302, the only decent heads you're going to find for that motor is the 1969 or 1970 351 Windsor heads, which was a C9 OE casting, which was 69, or a DOOE casting. And keep in mind, you want the DOOE casting that has 351 cast into the head. That's the one you're looking for. The 390, 352, 390, now there was a bunch of different versions of that head. They had low riser, medium riser, high riser, and that basically referred to the size of this port. This is a low riser, which is a small, low performance. The medium riser was much larger, and the high riser, you're never going to find a set of those anywhere. That was a real special NASCAR deal, and they're very rare. The 351 modified or Cleveland, the best heads, like I say, that you're going to find from the factory was probably around 1970. So you're looking for casting dates around 1970. Although the 428 Cobra Jet and 390 medium riser heads and so forth were pretty good back in the early to mid 60s. They had pretty good performance out of these. The other three, the Windsor, the Cleveland, and the 429 460, pretty much 69, 70, 71. After 1971, the compression ratios went way down. They made much bigger chambers, and basically they were smog heads. So hopefully that gives you some insight. So I'm going to go ahead and finish taking this build apart here. And I like to do things like this that are a little bit different and unique. And like I said, if you're looking for a decent motor for a rat rod or something and you're on a budget, man, I'll tell you, you can pick these things up for almost nothing. And for a pretty reasonable price, you can build one of these and you can make it's pretty good. You can also, so if you find a 400 crank, that's the thing, people talk about stroker engines. They have a factory 400 crank for this thing. It's basically the same block. They just put a longer stroke crank and a different piston and set of rods in it. If you can find a 400 rotating assembly, or just purchase, a rotating assembly for a 400, you can basically take this block, because we're not going to reuse the pistons, of course. These are dished pistons. We want a performance or a higher compression piston, a flat top. So if you can find a rotating assembly for a 400, it literally just bolts right into this block, and it's just like building a stroker engine. So you can stroke this thing out to 400 cubic inches, and you don't have to do any block relieving or anything crazy like that. It was designed from the factory just to bolt right into this block. So that's something we may do, I don't know. But if you actually got a 400 crankshaft, rods, and pistons and made this 400 cubic inches, put some good early 351 Cleveland heads on this, which I have a few pairs of those laying around here. We'll probably use those. This motor would be pretty good. The only challenges are going to be you probably have to fabricate some kind of motor mount deal for it, and you're definitely going to have a big block 429 460 bell housing transmission, or a standard transmission, whatever you do, but those are pretty easy to find. So hopefully this is intriguing you, and stay tuned, because I'm really not going to walk you through the teardown of this thing. I've got tons of videos doing teardown, but once I get this thing apart and inspected and machined, we'll start seeing what kind of parts we can round up for this turkey and see what we can do with it. See if we can make this thing a runner, and you know, hopefully this will help you. So you don't want to rule these engines out, even though they were a smog, crappy type motor. You know, we're probably just gonna trash the heads and the intake. I know that the heads and the intake are junk, but you know, if you take some better components and you put it in this, you can make a pretty good motor. So if you have any questions about any of these heads or these engine families, I know this is a huge subject. There's a lot of the thing about Ford. God, they changed so many things. I mean, I had a guy tell me one time, an old machinist I used to work with. He said, "I think Ford has an engine for every cubic inch from 1 all the way to like 600, because they've got a lot of industrial motors that nobody even knows about. They have so many different Ford engines out there. This is just a small example. These are the common V8 motors, but they had a bunch of other engines, that a lot of industrial stuff that nobody even really knows about. So they have, I mean, Ford had a ton of motors. They had a Y block, another V8 back in the day. They had a flathead. They had all. So this certainly isn't all of the V8s that we have available, but these are the common ones. So if you have any questions or you have any comments, or you have anything to add to this, I certainly don't know everything there is to know about Fords. Some of the information that I gave out may not be 100% accurate. I'm just going by some of the research that I've done. I know when it comes to Ford heads, there's so much that you could know and add to this. So I'm sure there's some Ford gurus out there. If you want to add anything, I welcome that. You know, if you want to correct something that I said, no problem. I'm doing the best I can, but I certainly don't know everything. I know a lot, but I don't know everything. So I try to tell people that all the time. When you start thinking that you know everything, the guy that knows everything, run away from him, because he's going to break stuff and hurt people. So just keep that in mind. So I appreciate you watching, and hopefully this will pique your interest, and we'll get started on tearing this thing down. And once we get going on the build, I'll document everything, and we'll walk through it, and we'll learn something together. I appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe below, right? Or make any comments that you want, and we'll see you soon. Bow, 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 bow.